Good evening, everybody. What a pleasure to see such a big crowd this evening. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank you, our virtual audience, for watching this wherever you happen to be, anywhere in the world. We often get questions from Australia or where? Bucharest. We have a regular in Genoa. If you're watching, Stefania, it's very nice to see you tonight. I'm convinced there are people all over the world who go to bed in the daytime and stay up all night to do this. So this is our event for Moonfall, which is the second in this series. And Jim, why don't we start by saying, why do you call it Moonfall?
Well, the basic big thread of this novel is the story takes place in a tidally locked planet. For those that didn't attend my first, how many people were here the first time? How many people were? So not many people haven't been here before. For those that haven't read the series at all, it takes place on a tidally locked planet, which basically means it circles the sun with one side always facing the sun, so it's burnt to a crisp. The other side's always away from the sun, so it's eternally cold and shrouded in ice. And the livable climb between those two extremes is what's called the crown. It circles between ice and fire. But the story begins in the first book where a young girl has a prophecy of the moon crashing and destroying the planet. It just then is to figure out, is that prophecy true? And if so, how in a medieval sort of structured society could you stop the moon from crashing into the planet? And that becomes a big quest, putting together a team to try to figure out how to stop that from happening in a nutshell.
So the first one, called The Starless Crown, had a very different look to it. I've been telling Jim, because I've been watching him signing it all day, what a really gorgeous cover I think this is. And you can see that we're going to a part of the planet that's cold, given all of this. And I was saying to Jim that it reminds me, to some degree, of the opening of The Last Odyssey. For those of you who remember the Sigma Force before last, most recent one, Kingdom of Bones, went to Africa, but the one before had those great opening scenes in Greenland. And I asked Jim if he had used his, time. You actually went to Greenland,
Yeah.
right? Yep. His time in Greenland to conceive of what the ice part of this planet would be. And one of the great things also about the book are the maps. So tell us a bit about the maps, because they're really very useful in us visualizing this world you've created.
How many people got my newsletter? A few hands. So in the newsletter I sent out, I showed the evolution of the map from the first version of the map, which looks like a third grader drew it, and that's probably insulting the third grader. And then I gave it to a wonderful graphic artist who specializes in cartography that I met online, and she was able to render it into the beautiful maps that you see in there. Both the crown, but on this side you see some maps of the ice side. The third book that's coming out will have maps of the sun-blasted side. So it's a great deal of fun to take things, basically I didn't want to just create a pure fantastical novel. I sort of described this as a scientific fantasy because I tried to make it as realistic as I could. When I first had this idea for this story, it wasn't necessarily going to be a fantasy. I read a Scientific American article about tidally locked planets, and I was curious about tidally locked planets. I thought, I'm wondering if life could actually exist on that planet. So I talked to some astrophysicists, and I said, hey, could life actually exist in a planet of such extremes? And they said, well, actually, probably so, because of the thermodynamics of movement of air from one hot side to the cold side and then the cold side to the hot side. There's going to be a little sort of pump that occurs. And there probably is a relatively temperate band between those two extremes. So life could theoretically exist between those two extremes. I thought, well, that's cool. Now, me being a veterinarian and, with a background in biology, I'm thinking, well, what might live there? So I began to work in the maps and creating different environmental niches and then trying to figure out evolutionary-wise what might live there. I just didn't want a dragon sitting on a mountaintop because that's where dragons live. I wanted to make sense that this is a creature that would live in this environment. So then I talked to xenobiologists and talked to them about comparing notes, basically, on what creatures might live in these extremes. And then I worked with also in this, besides the maps, you'll see on a page, I should have marked a page, but there's biological sketches of some of the creatures you see in here. And I worked with another graphic artist who also has a background in biology. And between her, she challenged me too, because I had just basic crude descriptions in the book, leave it to your own imagination, some of the details. But of course, when she's drawing it, she needs to know every detail. How's that claw curved? What is that length of that tail? What's how wide are those nostrils on that creature? And then we talked about why that the claws might be curved. Well, it's an arboreal type of creature, so maybe it's going to have a prehensile tail and hook claws versus just regular claws in a regular tail. So she helped, going back and forth with the graphic designer, helped also hone, what these creatures looked like. So it was a great deal of fun to build that world, both from the maps, from the working with the different graphic artists.
I can hardly believe that you've given me a chance to say Yellowstone tonight. For those of you who weren't here when Jim came with one of his books, for some of you were here, right? And I ruined the whole thing by talking about Yellowstone, which I did. I know. So Yellowstone, anyway, there are extremophobes that will tell them about it. You can let him go. You don't have to hold on to the leash on your foot.
Oh, I thought that was for me to hold.
No, it's okay. I don't think he'll go anywhere.
All right.
If he does, I'll chase him. There we go.
You're free. What was extremophiles?
Well, because if they're real on this world, then you're imagining them on another world. Makes sense.
In the Sigma novels, we've had Sigma Force Growing Company have gone into strange environments where, again, I got to play with my biological toolbox and build weird type of environments on the planet Earth, and then try to populate it with different types of beasties that would make sense from a biological standpoint. So this is just done in a fantastical landscape in a fantasy novel, but basically I'm following the same rules I was doing when I was creating the exotic lands and climates and geologies of the Sigma universe.
So when you say tidally locked, isn't there an assumption therefore that there's water on the planet? Or
tidally locked means basically it's like the moon is tidally locked around our planet.
Oh, okay. So it's not water; it's the moon.
It's actually it's not either. It's just the forces of gravity and mass that's between the planet and the sun.
Okay, so basically the planet's not rotating on its axis.
I'm not telling you anything.
It's too late for me to read it.
Some of the details on why that's happened. How many people have not read the first book? Okay, well.
Okay, we won't go into it then. Right.
Because there's a very poorly kept secret. I mean, the planet's named Earth.
But it's Earth with a U.
U-R-T-H, but it's probably our planet. So I'm not ruining anything. I think most people figure it out on by page 6. It's confirmed later on for sure, but initially it's not a poorly kept secret. So the question of being a scientific fantasy, there's a reason why the Earth has stopped spinning, and there's a way they're going to get this to start spinning again, but it's all based on science, not just magic. Well, there's some magic in the book too.
So if we have a national crisis, or rather an international crisis, you'll be able to fix it with the knowledge that you've gained.
I like the fact that just recently we learned that the core of the planet has stopped spinning, just in time for Cradle of Ice to come out.
Love it. So when the book opens, because we're just here in the very opening pages, I said to Jim, I feel as though I've embarked on a voyage to Antarctica. So you have a really dramatic voyage going on. So tell us about it.
I mean, basically, the second book deals with the excursion of the characters going into the frozen half of the world. Book 3, there'll be more on the sun-blasted side. Again, those that survive this.
You mean if anyone survives it?
Yes, there's not. Don't get attached to any of the characters. All I'll say. Things happen. But yeah, so it's basically it's a big adventure out into the ice world in one half of the story. The other half of the story follows a second-born prince who's in exile from his kingdom, who's been accused of being a traitor to the kingdom, and he's gone to the neighboring empire to try to enlist their aid in dealing with this world-ending crisis that nobody seems to believe except for this team. So there's the story told in 2 different viewpoints. One is set in the Crown with Prince Canth. The other one is with Nyx and her Mirbat Bashilia and their team heading out into the frozen wastes of the ice.
So when you say second-born prince, are you actually saying spare?
Pretty much. I mean,
I know it's a topical joke at the moment, but nonetheless, I can't resist it.
Well, the nickname of Prince Canth is the prince in the cupboard is what he's derived, or they basically he's a humiliating little title they give him, the prince of the cupboard, because basically he's a prince that's only kept in the cupboard just in case something happens to the real prince that's destined to be. So
he is the spare.
He's the spare. So,
definitely.
So he has a little resentment about that. And he's born twin. He's born just minutes late, from becoming the king. So
Resentment appears to be a fairly common emotion for spares.
apparently, so he's quite embittered. And the beginning of Starless Crown, he's a bit of a drunkard, and he's trying to live up to his lowly status a little bit. And it's him coming to his own in the first book, and then in the second book, he has to start assuming the mantle of something that he can't deny anymore. Can't say anything. I want to tell you stuff. What happens is
So, how are they traveling in this
lots of big
opening?
surprises in this book. Is all I'll say. Huge surprise. I mean, I have a critique group, and they were like, when I turned in that section, they were like, "Oh my!" It was like they called me up and said, "I can't believe you just did that." Well, that's my goal, is to startle you.
It's your story. You can do anything
Exactly.
you want with it. Anyway, tell us about, because they're traveling in an interesting way. We can at least talk about that because we're not going to spoil anything.
Yeah, the means of transportation within this world is they have the ability to produce a gas that can create these. So basically, it's a Zeppelin type of ships that
Right.
can travel the world, and they use those two rivers, those two climate rivers that are very strong. They use that to flow between the two sides of the crown. So
So those
Yeah.
of you who know anything about Zeppelins know that Zeppelins can be fragile and subject to fire. So how is this
Which-
machine powered?
happens in chapter 1.
I'm sticking to chapter 1, but
Yeah,
I did think
disasters happens aboard that ship. While
right.
in the middle of the frozen lands.
So I was interested in why forges? Are these people how advanced are they that they would actually have to have a forge with fire to propel the ship instead of say electricity?
Well, because there's alchemists on this planet, and they've developed what's called flash burn. It's sort of a very potent version of gasoline that they use to basically create little jets associated with it, so they can maneuver their crafts. So it's all a bit of alchemy, a bit of steampunk type of technology.
Well, when you're making up a world, you can do anything you want with it, right? So you can make it. I've always found it so interesting that some of the big fantasies, like Lord of the Rings, why is it that with all the sophisticated, I'm trying to think what else I saw that I could apply that to. With all the sophisticated stuff they've got in magic, they're still basically medieval. They're still wandering around looking like they strolled into like a frost fair on the
Yeah.
Thames or something in 1500. And, it doesn't really jive with the
That's true.
phenomenal technology. So did you decide that you were going to do an upgrade from that, or did you want them to appear to be more rustic than they need to be, or
I
what?
wanted to try to balance them between, if you were at a certain level of society and dealing with those extremes, and you were dealing with a society that was fairly repressive and controlling the reins of scientific knowledge,
Mhm.
which is a part of one of the themes. Is there's one of the villains of the story is trying to wrest the reins of scientific knowledge from everybody else. He wants to possess it for himself, for power and for knowledge. And so in that environment, I tried to just have a little bit of balance between the beginning of technology in this world. At the same time, people are trying to repress it just because they don't want that power causing that they don't want the technology causing a shift in power. So
Well, one of the big debates going on in the real world is, is there life on other planets, and is whatever if the thing is called that's out there with the Hubble, is that it? Not the Hubble. What is it called?
the James Webb.
Thank
Yep.
you. As is going farther out into the universe, the question is, are there any other habitable planets?
Yeah, well, that gets answered in the next Sigma novel.
Well, what they're looking for is what? CO2? Isn't that what it is? That if there's CO2 somewhere in the
They're looking for all different types of biosignatures and
Right.
technosignatures for looking for identifying evidence of life on other planets. But I can't go into too much. That's all about. We'll talk about that in August when the next Sigma novel comes out. 'Cause,
all right.
The
So
gist of that novel is
we have a date for the next Sigma Force novel,
Could there
which is
be life on other
August
planets?
15th. For those of you who want to take notes, we've already got that one worked out. I know, it's great. But no, the thing, is that most of the time when you're any of the scientific things and all, it's all, if we find creatures, they're either wildly weird or they're like us. And I don't know that we can even envision what kind of life form we might find
yeah,
on
we're
other planets.
different type of essays about what life would be like, and most likely it would be nothing that we would recognize.
Exactly.
Probably at the baseline biological level of viruses, bacteria. There's probably some mimicking that will occur, but once you start seeing where that goes from, it's probably not going to look nothing like what we look like.
So the advantage we
Hold
have
me to that.
is we're right. Well, but the thing is that we became sentient, and it's not necessarily true
Some
that
of
life
us.
anywhere else. Well, some of us, right? Sorry, and it appears that's vanishing even as we talk here. But that's not necessarily going to be true. If we find life forms on other planets, they may or may not be sentient.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's at this point, that's the whole premise, I guess, of Star Trek is, going different planets and dealing with there's sentient life there or not, and
Boldly go,
exactly
right? Love it. So what can we talk about besides the first chapter?
nothing at all. We're all just going to sit very quietly and just contemplate the cover. No, basically, I'll answer some of the common questions that if I don't answer it now, you're going to ask it anyways. Is early in my first, why fantasy?
Okay.
James Rollins is known as the Scotto Pace thriller writer of scientific adventure novels, and so why this? Again, I think I gave a little bit of a gist that it came from an idea that I thought was going to be part of maybe the Sigma universe, is dealing with a tidal lock planet, and I thought, I don't know what to do with this. Do I make this a thriller to try to create a tidal lock planet? Does maybe something cause the Earth to stop spinning, and that creates a big Sigma novel? Or do I go way into the future where this has happened, way in the millennia ago into the distant, faded history, and now we're dealing with what life looks like on this new generation of planet Earth that's not moving. And so I had both ideas in my head. Which do I want to write? And so I wasn't sure. So I talked to my editor. I talked to my agent, and I said, I have these, two ideas of what to write, and whether it's the planet stops spinning, it threatens that the moon's going to crash into the Earth, or I'm way into the future where this is going to happen. And he says, well, I represent a screenplay writer who just sold his script called Moonfall, the same title as your series. So I'd suggest you do the fantasy. So that became that. The other question I asked, again, it might seem sort of a weird departure, but early in my career, I was writing fantasies and thrillers every year.
Right. And why don't you remind us under what name you wrote some of them?
Well, to backtrack really quickly is, I had a hard time selling my first thriller, Subterranean, 49 different letters of rejection, which takes a long time to collect. In the meantime, I thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. I'm going to jump ship and write a different genre that I love to read, which is fantasy. Began working on a fantasy novel. Eventually, I find an agent who says, hey, I think I can sell your thriller. I said, well, you're wrong, because we have 49 other agents who say basically this is unpublishable, but good luck. And then I went ahead and within about a week went from unpublished to suddenly I had an offer for the thriller and an offer for the fantasy. And suddenly I went from unpublished to having two different genres, two different publishing houses. And they both said, we don't like your real name. Give us two pen names. So it's a poorly kept secret. James Rollins is not my real name. I shouldn't probably say that. But it isn't. Writers are liars. We make, but if you go to the copyright page,
I can interrupt and tell you that it's so challenging that one time when Jim was coming over, you know how the weird time frame goes in Phoenix right now.
She keeps rubbing this in my face.
So most of the time,
Jim can't tell time.
Jim in California and we are on the same time, but during Mountain Standard Time, we're not. So Jim came over to do an event and thought he would take a nap. And so our event started and there's no sign of Jim. So I went over to the Hotel Valley Ho. I knew where he was. And I asked for James Rollins. No, there's nobody here by that name. And then I went, oh my God, that's right. And I, it took me forever to say, okay, CZ. Why? Oh, they said.
Yeah, usually the CZ gets you there most of the time.
Right.
That's all you really need.
And so they woke him up, and
I wasn't asleep. I was in the shower at that point.
Oh, is that what it was? Okay.
I was working out at the gym, got in the shower, and I hear my phone ringing. I thought, who's calling me? And I pick up the phone, and it's got shampoo in my hair, and it's Barbara. It's like, Jim,
laughing.
You're due for this event. We're going to do a broad. We had like we're going to we're doing like film thing. Wasn't the book event? We were doing something on video or something. I can't remember what it was. I very remember.
Was that back in the old days we went over to the studio and we
exactly. It was that.
Okay, we actually did our first video event in 1995. So, everybody says, "Oh, you handled cold so well." And I said, "No, actually, we just got a better tool because Zoom is way better than live stream, which is way better than the other thing. But we have archives that go all the way back to
Yeah. So
1995.
if you go see that, why is Jim's hair soaking wet?
Right. He was nervous, right?
That's-
Right. Oh, you're on the move. Okay. You're going to look at everybody?
Watching
Good
that other
boy.
puppy.
Right.
It's a guard dog. Guard that author.
Well, if he sends an unmistakable signal, I will race outside. Right. I don't know. As I said, he's never done this before, so I don't think he has any clue what the rules of the game are. But
You're very calm. Yeah.
yeah, but he's a good boy. Anyway, I've lost track now of where we were.
You have a question? See, that's what I was gonna ask.
good
That was a
question.
leading to. So I ended up with both theories, and the answer is whatever I'm not writing at that time is what I love best. So what I found is that when I'm writing a thriller, I'm thinking I've just painted Gray and Company or whoever into a corner. I have no idea how to get them out of that corner. I need a magic wand. And then when I'm in the fantasy, I'm thinking I need a telephone and an airplane because I need to get these characters and this information from here to there. Hence the flying ships. I needed a means of transportation. Of dealing with a global-sized fantasy novel. It would take them a long time on horse to go from one side of the planet to the other. So I needed a means of transportation that I need to create for this novel just to get the characters from point A to point B.
How have you cracked the distance communication barrier?
They don't they can't really communicate very well. It's just one means of communication that's opens up very shortly, but it only occurs in this novel. I can't tell you what it is.
Okay. All right.
There's a means of long means of communication, but I can't ruin that surprise either.
You're not being totally upstage.
Yeah, it's not magic either. There's a scientific basis for it.
Right. Maps. Let's go back to the maps because I really love the way that you have created this very cold world and you're sending people off into it. Even you can see it so well on the, even the sort of rocks there and so forth are, I think, is it glacier? Are they glacier covered or just rocks?
Yeah, the glacier. Half of it's glacier covered, half of it's just raw, cold rock. Hang on a second. You can appreciate it from a distance. But. So when I was doing the map for the frozen half of the world, again, I didn't want to make it just pure fantasy. The world has been decimated when the world stopped turning, became continent shifted, oceans changed. But the basic structure is the same. So you'll notice if you look at the map of the frozen waste, there's a spot called the mouth of the world and the creche.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course I have to have them. It can't just be it'd be a very boring story if it's like there's more ice and then they go to the next page. Oh, look, more ice and it's even colder. Something had to happen. I need to have a place where they could have an adventure on this frozen half. So I needed an area that possibly has a sort of a geothermal heating source that would allow life to possibly exist in that world. So if you look at that map and you might look at, gosh, there's a mountain level over here, and just to the right of those mountains, there's this big heated area that's quite large in volume between the mouth of the world and the creche. And that's, can you guess what I based that on? Yellowstone.
Yellowstone. I was going to say another chance to say Yellowstone. I love it.
So there's some matching. You'll find some geology that matches, our planet a little bit in that world.
But this planet, you have endowed it with oceans.
There's oceans in the temperate area. There is oceans in that area, but this is just basically a lot of ice and something else. But I won't say what that is.
So this is intended to be unusually not a trilogy, but a tetralogy. You don't often get a 4-book series instead of a 2-book series or a 3-book series. You get duology. Wait, do I have that right? Duology, tetralogy. What's a quad? Is it a quad? I'm losing my Latin. What's 4? Quadrology? Well, anyway, 4 is an unusual number for a series. So we're halfway through with 2 to go. So when you're doing something like that, Jim, do you have to consider the entire story arc? Do you know what's happening from book 1 through book 4?
Yes, I know where I know the mini arcs of every of the four installations. I know the bigger arc where it's going to land. I don't necessarily know great detail about some of the stuff that happens between
Right.
those what I call my tent poles of the story. But the basic skeleton of the story, both each of the four volumes of the book and of the entire arc of the series, I do know.
So this is, although you might not think so, this is actually a lot longer than the Starless Crown. So how many words did you go up? 100 and
So Starless Crown, I think, it was just about 200,000 words. This is 250,000 words. So
we weren't going to discuss that.
we're going to discuss that.
It is actually bigger than the
Yeah,
Starless
so Starless
Crown.
Crown is in page count. Starless Crown is like 550 pages. This is 650 pages.
Yeah.
But the pages are yes, they're thinner. So
Be careful.
it's all
turning
about
them.
printing and how many
Yeah.
books you can package in a box. It's all economics.
So what I wanted to ask.
Use it as it's like
Right.
tissue paper. You can blow your nose afterwards with it. So we get to the sad part. Just rip out that page and.
So, do you think that people expect in an epic fantasy, do they expect an epic by, I mean, grand, large story per book?
Well, whenever I teach writing, I always say you should write what you love to read. So again, I love to read action adventure stories. I like the Michael Crichton scientific type of stories. So that became Sigma. But I also was an avid fantasy reader, and to me, the longer the fantasy, the better. If there are multi volumes in the series, all the better. So that's why I like that epic, door stopper of a fantasy. So if you look at my early fantasy books, same way. They're the door stopper novels, and so it's what I love to. It's what I love to write, and I think there's a large audience in the fantasy world that wants to live in that world. At least that's my experience. When I beginning a fantasy novel, I want to be lost in that world. I want to spend time in that world, and I want to be transported to that world. And if I'm going to learn all about this world, I want to spend some time there. I don't want to learn all about it and then get kicked out. I want to spend some time there. So.
Right. But if the world is going to make any sense to the reader, you have to spend a fair amount of time setting it up.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's going to be a bigger story.
It is, and that's a juggling act between revealing what the world's dynamics are like.
Yeah.
Both from what's the religion, what's the government, what's the science, what level of scientific advancement are we at? At the same time, you got to get this plot going. You got to get the characters developed. So there's a lot of balls you have to juggle and try to.
Well, there's a lot of
well.
stuff taking up space that generally, if you're writing a thriller or something, you try to whittle down to the minimum. Right.
Exactly. Well, the goal of your, I can't remember who said this. I think this was Jeffrey Deaver. Said, I think it was Jeffrey Deaver. He said that when you're reading like a mystery or a thriller, the goal is to get to the end. Who did the killing? Who's the murderer?
Or who wins?
How is the world saved? I think more with fantasy, of course, we do want to find out how things resolve, but at the same time, we want to enjoy that journey a little bit more.
So, as a writer, do you find it easier to write fantasy because you have more room? You don't have to constantly sort of prune it down? Or is it just a different, is it the same as writing Sigma in terms of effort on your part?
They're different beasts. What I found is that when, again, I wrote Cradle of Ice, and then I wrote Tides of Fire back to back, and they're very different means of writing. I tried writing Sandstorm in one of my fantasies at once upon a time, and it was almost like stripping my gears in my head, trying to go from one book back and forth. But it's they each have their own challenges. Like with fantasy, is that you have to keep judging how many weird words do I want you to have to learn. Do they use a spoon in this fantasy world? Do they call it a spoon, or is it called a slop feeder? Or it's so you have to keep thinking. Where's that balancing line between creating this verisimilitude that you're in this fantasy landscape, at the same time you're using words that really shouldn't be in a fantasy landscape necessarily. So that's a challenge, and then just having to describe every little detail, because I can say, he went to a coffee shop down the street, and you can all in your head sort of picture what that coffee shop is if I'm writing a thriller. Well, I'm describing this tavern. I need to describe it in great detail. What's it like? How is it shoveled? It requires a lot more detail that needs to be incorporated and thought about. So they're literally, it takes me about the same time to write a page of this as it does take a page of the thriller. It's still about the same. It takes me an hour to write a double space page, pretty much no matter what I'm writing. Even though you think I don't have to, when I'm writing the thriller, I got to check everything. Like the Tides of Fire takes place in around Australia and Southeast Asia, and you have to check every detail. Like, there's a flight. Well, how many hours if they're driving that, taking that jet from here to point A, and then have to calculate it out, and the wind speed velocity of a African sparrow, and then
Because otherwise, you fans will write him really rude letters and say, "No, it didn't take that long," or
and
"It
then
took
again, you have to
longer."
assume people have been to some of these places,
Yep.
so you have to make sure every detail is correct. There's a couple of museums that take place in this next novel, and I have to make sure, like, what's on the first floor of this museum, and I've not been to this museum, so I'm going online trying to find a map to this museum, or I'm calling somebody else and saying, can you send me a brochure about this place? Whereas the fantasy, you're making it all up theoretically, but at the same time, if they're working with horses, then you have to know your sort of horse tack correctly and things that make sense. And if they're flying ships, you want to make sure that you're using the correct nautical terms for ships. And so there's some education that has occurred even in
So, what about
fantasy.
names? Names are a subject we've talked about lately with a number of authors because there's real emotional freight with names. Each of you probably has a name that you don't like, probably based on some jerk that was called that. I'm not going to reveal mine. I did the other night, and then I was embarrassed because I thought maybe that person was actually in the room, and I've just said, But so when you're making up names in a fantasy that don't have to conform necessarily to the sorts of names that you
Sure.
would put in a thriller, how do you go about that?
I have to be able to pronounce it because I know I'm going to get the audio reader's note saying, please pronounce all of these words. So I have to do that. But also, usually I'm trying to catch a flavor of that character in the name a little bit. Just it's not the fantasy, but for like Grayson is gray because he sort of walks the line between extremes, so he's in that blurry line. Monk I stole because I'm a big Doc Savage fan, and so I borrowed Monk from the Doc Savage crew and brought him into Sigma. So everybody has this. There's a reason why each name is what it is. It's just not necessarily. Well, sometimes it's just pulling it out of my butt. So there's a lot of names up there apparently.
But in a fantasy, don't you first have to establish I mean, you're going to have to stick with the same alphabet, right? Or nobody's going to be able to read it. You'll think you're reading Chaucer or something. So you have to stick with our alphabet, but
Somewhat, yeah.
you get okay. If you have you can use runes or something magical, and then you have to translate it or what?
Well, luckily, there's epigraphs that open up each section, and I went to using Middle English to make them feel like they're these old.
Oh, Chaucer was not a
Yeah.
bad thing on my
Exactly.
part.
So
Right?
there's a reason for that.
Okay.
And each of the landscapes do have their own societies, and there are different characters. Again, there's clues. Andrew, about some of the lettering that occurs in different types of like the Kingdom of Hallanday has a slightly different character set than the Empire does.
Okay.
And if you look at the character sets of those the things, they're giving you a hint a little bit about where in the real world this story is taking place.
Okay. Well, you're going to have dynastic names,
Yeah.
surnames,
And then again,
and then
some of it's
first names.
so like and there's different nomenclatures for different societies. The Empire sort of has a different nomenclature on how they use like Mr. or Sir or Knight. That's different from what the Empire does. So each society has their own sort of honorifics that they use.
So how do you keep track of it all? Do you have some kind of
There's a Bible.
Bible
Oh,
that
yeah.
you've created for the series?
And it's I'm going to make you read it. No.
You could actually probably publish it at the end, but
No, it'd be
I mean,
very
seriously,
boring.
it would be fun. But
Yes, sir.
oh, sure.
You talked about, I believe, the tent posts.
Yes.
Art.
Yep.
Are there times when you're going through that arc and those tent posts, and then I want to put this in here, I want to add this, or I want to add.
Oh, yeah. That's why I try to keep it fairly. I keep my outlines fairly skeletal. There's some pivotal points that I have to get to because there's certain things that are going to have to. There's a phrase plan it early, pay it off later, when it comes to fiction writing, and that you have to certain things have to be set up. Certain tentpoles have to be in place for my resolution to the story to make sense. So those tentpoles are there's certain ones that are inviolate. They must be there. Other tent poles are, well, if I get there, I get there. But what happens between those tent poles, I don't know. Sometimes I have no clue how they're going to go from point A to point B in this plot. And to me, that's the joy of writing, is the discovery of that story. It allows the characters to motivate where they're going to go. A lot of times, if I try to force a character that I haven't designed them that way or built them that way, they wouldn't act that way. And even if so, that means I've got to shift things around a little bit to get to that next tent pole.
In your writing, have you ever reached a point where you said, I got to change how this is going to move?
You probably need to repeat that.
Oh, sorry, folks. Yeah, it's the question that is about the structuring the story and the fact that I build a skeletal outline, and I set up some initial tent poles that are, and some of them that are set in stone. I can't move them, otherwise the ending is not going to make any sense. And at this point, I'm working on my 47th book, and I've landed in almost every single book that I can think of. Has landed where I needed it to land. There's been no surprises where it landed. So I stick pretty closely to that. Those immovable tent poles stay unmovable. Other tent poles, they're not that critical to the story. So if they does it make sense to go there, then I won't go there. But I do need to get to that immovable tent pole at some point.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes in the script, one of the characters will be speaking in their native tongue, and then you'll say it in English right after that. How did you derive the native tongue?
For this book?
Uh-huh.
Again, there's some clues. Andrew, don't know Andrew. Andrew, let me just tell you about Andrew. So,
Andrew was just Yellowstone. No, there's a real Andrew.
Yes, Andrew right there in the blue shirt.
Oh, there is Andrew. Hi, Andrew. You're a real person and not a fantasy.
He is the.
From the first book, The Moonfall.
Yes, I'm going to tell you about Andrew. Because it relates to what you're going to say.
Okay.
Or answer your answer, rather. So, back in the past, I had one of those inserts for one of the novels, and it was one of my. I can't remember which novel it was even. Do you remember which novel it was? So it was, again, sort of a gothic fantasy, gothic vampiric novel that I wrote. And I had this sort of code written out in this strange type of script. And I had a contest where I was going to say, well, whoever can solve that code first will give you a little prize. So, passed out the inserts, thinking, well, it's going to take a couple months for somebody to figure it out. And like 10 minutes later, I think I solved it. And he did. So when it comes to, again, relating to, there's some clues in the language also about where these places, because some of you look at there are certain words that actually are, I'm not totally making up, they are from a certain language on this planet that gives you a hint that, oh, this is where.
So it could be from an actual language from.
There is usually a basis. It's not just pure, there's a underlying, a lot of it is made up. But buried in there are some hints of the original language.
Amongst themselves, and then they'll say something, and then you'll say what it is in English.
Right. So basically, I'm building a little bit of verisimilitude by having them. If you're from the kingdom and you go to the empire has their own terms for different things, and so when you're speaking to somebody from the empire, they're most likely going to use their term for that. So I'm just sort of using that as a way of giving a little hint to the reader about where the story originated from. Plus, I also like just making up languages. So it's fun to, go back into my old German language classes and get my, noun verb thing.
Declension. Now they
Exactly.
decline.
So
Yeah. German and Russian.
So again, big part of that Bible is making sure that the language makes sense for each of those different lands.
So before we leave Andrew behind, since Andrew is here, how did you luck into Andrew, or maybe Andrew lucked into you?
For when he just showed up at a signing and just kicked my butt with solving that riddle. He has, yeah.
You have. Where do you travel, so to speak? You must. You what? Oh, so you've been to the signings here.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought for a dizzy moment you were tracking him around the country. Right.
No, I don't have any stalkers.
Do you know somebody said that to me once some years ago? Various authors said to me that we're the only bookstore they go to where there's no resident stalker. That's a really, now that was before COVID, but nonetheless, I thought to myself afterward, now I know we have Andrew. So I'm going to give it a different answer. Love it.
I want a stalker. I'm still waiting for somebody to stalk me.
Right. All right. Anybody else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I love the creation of this sort of song-based communication and the weaving of the different sort of conversations that are happening in stores and spaces and new information. How did you come up with that?
Well, basically, I was basing it on the ultrasonics of a bat, because the bat biology, there's basically a sentinel that, in this storyline, and that were engineered long in the past to be biological sentinels for the planet, to be there in case something happens. And there's also these mechanical sentinels that are also in place. And so there's like a biological and mechanical type of combination to try to protect the planet after it stops spinning. Why, I'm not going to tell you. But so I figure, well, how did they, again, from the scientific basis, how do they engineer these bats to be able to use ultrasonics in such a manner? And what if that gene that they engineered started to seep into the human population, and certain humans started to develop the similar type of ultrasonic means of communication, hence bridal song that creeps into the human population.
And I also, if you poll or something on people who would love for you to pronounce your Bible or appendices, I would like to put my vote in.
Okay, one vote. A couple more. Okay.
Or maybe you have to buy, maybe you have to buy the audiobook in order to hear. You know, we go through life, don't we, reading words and nobody's ever pronounced them in front of us. So we really just are taking a guess. And sometimes then we're surprised when we hear somebody say it. But would the audiobook kind of solve that problem?
The audiobook reader for this is Nicola. I don't know my kind of last name. But oh my gosh, she is just beautiful. Her ability to how she reads the novels. Like, who wrote that? Because I didn't write that. There's no way I wrote that. It sounds so beautiful, and when you're saying it. I will never do a reading aloud myself, by the way, because it sounds horrible when I read. But it's just I just heard the excerpts for her reading of Cradle of Ice. It's just so beautiful.
So one of the things I think that gives the Sigma Force books so much verisimilitude is that Jim travels to, visit those places. One epic evening, we went out to dinner after one of these events, and Jim was rejecting all carbohydrates. And I said to him, "What's all that about?" And he wanted to go. Where were you going?
Vietnam, to cave in Vietnam.
To go caving. And in order to do that, he had to slim down so he didn't get stuck in the cave. So, no, I'm serious. I tried it afterward, and I found that I just couldn't manage without carbohydrates. So I particularly admired your dedication to that.
Well, it's a carrot and the stick type of thing. Is that I've been caving since college, and it's a sport I loved. But over time, it's sort of I would still attend the grotto meetings where somebody would talk about caving in certain aspects out of San Francisco. And I was attending one of the meetings, and I hadn't caved like about 3 or 4 years, and I was like 50 something at this point, and my waistline was getting a little bit bigger, and my knees were getting a little creakier, and I'm thinking, well, caving's a young man's sport, it's
a young thin man's sport.
I'm gonna stick to scuba diving because you can float. And so this gentleman was up there. He was describing his caving trip, and it was a very technical. It was a very vertical cave. It required a lot of rope work to be able to ascend and descend it. And he had maps and the cool pictures from it, and very challenging. And I don't know, I could do that in my youth. It looks so hard. And this guy was 65. So I'm thinking, well, I'm using this as an excuse of being 50, and so I'm gonna get back in shape. And so I needed that carrot. So there's a caving grotto sponsored caving trip to Vietnam, but I needed to be in shape for it. At that point, I was not ready to go to such an extreme hard cave. So
when I travel, I take photographs of caves. When I was doing the Lower Danube, there's a really cool cave. I take photos and I send them to Jim. So try to keep
Done
him
that.
interested. Right, done that one. It's hard to find a cave he hasn't actually been into at this point. So when you did your Vietnam trip and all, what book did that come in, or is that coming into the new book?
It's coming a little bit in the new book. There's a section in Tides of Fire that takes place in a cavern system, but of course, my characters always go underground. Even my editor was like, "Are they going underground again, Jim?"
Yeah,
Yes,
but
they
you know,
are.
there was that really terrible group of, horrible thing when that group of kids got lost or stranded in a cave. Was it in Thailand,
That
wasn't
was
it?
Thailand. Yep, that was what's his name?
I think
Ron
they
Howard did a
rescued
beautiful-
all of
did a
them, if
great
I
movie
remember
about them.
correctly, but it was, scary.
Yep.
That was what?
One of the rescuer.
Oh,
No, if you haven't seen the movie, Ron Howard did a movie that's really riveting that tells that story.
yeah.
It's really good.
Anyone else have, Patrick, are there questions from the live,
there are.
the
Is this thing
virtual?
working, kind of, sort of? Okay. Yes, there are a few questions that have come in, and let me see if I can. Let's see here. Sorry, I was all set up and I lost my place here.
Have you
Okay.
been to Karcher Caverns down south of Tucson?
No, I have not.
It's
It's very interesting.
very cool. Karchner Caverns.
I mean, it's not actual caving.
Well, I enjoy show caves just as much as
I've been to the
the
And
the
then
show
it's
caves are lots of fun.
interesting that different parts of the year, you can't go in one side because that's where the bats live.
Cool.
Right.
That's cool.
Of course, that's why there's bats in in the story too. By the way,
Okay,
I like caving, so we're gonna put bats.
got it. Sean Hicks would like to know, as an author, how do you connect with professionals in the scientific and other fields to pick their brain about this stuff to make the novel as accurate as possible?
So again, did they hear that, or need to repeat the question, or with your microphone? Could they hear
I think
that?
they could probably hear it online.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question, if you haven't heard it, was basically how do I, as an author, communicate with or get connections with the scientific community or the military community? I get that question asked a lot too. Is for the scientists, it's because they love talking about their work, and their wives or husbands out there, they don't want to hear about it. So when they have an avid audience of somebody that shows interest in their specialty, they are very keen to communicate. And me is writing a scientific thriller. It takes a long time to write a book. As Tides of Fire was completed almost a year ago. It's not coming out until August. So there's a long lag time between when I get the idea, then I have to write it, then there's a editorial process, then there's a long lag time before it finally hits the shelves. And science changes very rapidly. So what might seem current or true when I begin a novel could theoretically change by the time the novel comes out. And so I don't want that to happen. And so when I'm ever talking to the scientists, I'll do this uniformly. I usually have at least one person that's willing to talk about whatever scientific aspect of this novel. Tides of Fire deals with, again, I mentioned before about the search for life on other planets. So I talk to different scientists out there that are specialists in those fields to get, again, the most current tools and technologies that they're using out there, so that when my novel comes out, that it feels current. So I ask them, don't tell me, what was in your last journal article 3 months ago, or that book you're working on that's going to come out in a year. Tell me, turn around and tell me what's on your lab table right now, 'cause I need that level of immediacy so that when my novel comes out, it still feels fresh and new. And so a lot of times people will think, "Oh, Jim, you seem very prescient about some of the science you bring up in novels. I read this in your novel, and listen, my editor does this all the time. I'll write something, and then like when the book comes out, something comes out that's directly related to some discovery that was like, Jim, you had that in your novel already. Well, yeah, because I talked to that guy already. That's why it might seem like I'm predicting it, but no, he just told me. There's no forecasting. Exactly. Well, again, it's not hard to do. You can just go online and you just put xenobiologist, and you'll find a list of publications. You'll find the university has a xenobiologist. You call it university and say, "Hey, is so and so still at university?" Yes. Would he mind speaking? I'm an author working on a novel. Would he be willing to talk about his work? And they're usually 9 times out of 10 they'll say yes. Occasionally they'll say sorry, but.
Anything else, Patrick?
Yeah, another question. Are there any other authors that are working in your field that you really enjoy? Other thriller writers?
Oh, there's tons of them. Again, Steve Berry is my frenemy.
Steve Berry will actually be kicking off his new book here. What is it? Monday.
Don't promote him.
Well, you brought him up, and they've already bought your book, so you're perfectly safe. I'm trying to
No,
remember.
I love
It's
Steve Berry.
Monday
Buy his books.
the 21st. Thank you very much. Right.
Yeah, I mean, again, we talked about Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child before. Again, I was reading him. Remember, I was writing Subterranean, which takes place. It's 2 miles underneath Antarctica, and I just finished it. I was trying to sell it and having a hard time. And then I read Relic. I thought, oh, no wonder I'm not selling my book. This is so brilliant. And then I finally got Subterranean. I found a home for it, and it sold. And I wrote my second book, Excavation, and Douglas Preston was kind enough to give me a blurb, so it was really cool to have that. I was just reading his book, and now he's blurbing me, or Clive Cussler for that matter. So again, I can go on and on with the authors I read that in the genre. Almost any thriller writer I've read at least one or two books of almost everybody out there.
Jim was actually, I have it right, the awards chairman, weren't you, for
Yeah.
Thriller Fest for a long time, which meant that he had to read an enormous number of other thriller writers in order to sort all that out, right?
Yep.
That it?
Does somebody ever come out with a book and you say, damn, I wish I'd thought of that idea?
All the time. All the time. And sometimes, what's even worse, though, is we do write the same book at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Sometimes that happens when there are events that spark off people's imagination, more than one person because the event is significant enough.
well. Let's bring up Steve Berry
Again,
again.
the 21st. Hello.
So I wrote this. I always get my books mixed up. What's the one that takes place in the Smithsonian where there's they burn it down? It's anyways. It deals with the history of the Smithsonian. For those that don't know Sigma Force's headquarters are beneath the Smithsonian Castle
right.
on the National Mall. And so I've been collecting a bunch of information about the Smithsonian Castle because that's where Sigma is. So I got all this history of the Smithsonian Castle and the Smithsonian institution itself, and had all these sheets and things, and began working on the story about the history of the Smithsonian and the Smithsonian Castle that was going to play a part of the story. And then I thought, well, gosh, Steve works with the Smithsonian Library Association. I'm going to call him and get him some more details. So I said, hey, Steve, I'm halfway through this novel and I'm working on the Smithsonian, story. And he says, what are you doing? Well, you're doing what? I said, yeah, I'm doing, Sigma's underneath the Smithsonian. That's the basis of my next novel. It says it's coming out in 2 months. I said, Steve, my characters in this. I own the Smithsonian. Just get out of that Smithsonian. Do you have characters underneath the Smithsonian? So we ended up having 2 books almost come out at the same time that all deal with the history of the Smithsonian.
But very differently, which is one of the great things about books is you can do the same thing, but it all comes out differently. Yes, ma'am.
Thriller by August, and then we need this? Or are you in bed and reading or thinking of something, and then it just sparks something, and then your whole novel starts beginning? Or are you like on a deadline that I have to do this, so you're forcing yourself to?
It's a little bit of both. Obviously, I have a contract, and there are built-in deadlines for what they want when they want the books. But they don't necessarily tell me what the books are. They give me the freedom to figure out what that is. And it changes. Initially, very early in my career, when Lissa, my editor, had picked Subterranean out and decided to publish it, she required me whenever I was pitching her a story idea. She wanted a detailed outline. It was 20-page single space, lay out every character, every plot line, every subplot line. Lay it all out. And then I turned it in, and she goes, yeah, that's a good story. Here's some money. Thank you. And then I'd go home and go, I don't like that idea anymore. And so I read an entirely different novel, and I turned it in. And she goes, this is nothing like the outline that you sent in. So, yeah, do you like it? Yeah. Well, shut up. So... Because when I wrote Map of Bones, it's not ruining this. This is not ruining anything. This happens in the prologue of Map of Bones, so don't worry. I'm not going to ruin the book. I woke up one Sunday morning. I'm a bit of a lapsed Catholic, and it was Sunday morning, and I thought, what if somebody poisoned the communion wafers at a church, and they got distributed? Then by the end of the church, everybody dies. End of the mass, everybody dies. I like that idea. Has nothing to do with the novel I just pitched, but I like that idea. I could see it in my head. So I again sold that long idea to Lissa, but I came back to her and said, "Hey, I don't know where the story's leading, but I know you bought that. But think about this: what if somebody poisons the community away from the church and everybody dies? How cool is that?" And then gave her a couple of little plot points to go along with it. And then she goes, "Yeah, write that one instead." So sometimes even she's like, forget that idea. This one's cooler. So a lot of it is just that dawn of an idea or that seed that gets planted that becomes a story.
A lot of it is they can't actually hand over money unless they have some basis for it. So you do have to turn in some idea in order to get. Authors don't get paid all at once. They get paid in stages,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Sometimes dragged out a long way.
Yep.
But to get it going, the editor has to believe that you're going to finish a book. That's why all debut novels are not. You have to turn in an entire book. If you're writing a first novel, they aren't going to buy it on 20 pages or an outline. You have to actually write the book to prove that you can do that. But after that, you can get away with quite a bit because they know that you can actually finish a book, right?
Most times. I'll use this one example of the most, and I've told this before because I know I've told this in this room before about an author that just, again, 49 different rejections, could not get this thing sold. Had completed a novel. But another author had written like the first 30 pages. This had never been published before. It's like the first 30 pages of the story, and he had a rough outline for the rest. But he had a wonderful log line for his novel. His log line for the novel was Jurassic Shark. So just those two words, pretty much you know what that book's going to be about. It's going to be like Jurassic Park, but with a giant man-eating prehistoric shark. That became Meg. So based upon that 30 pages and that outline, those two-word log line, he sold the book, he sold the movie rights,
but
and he bought like 2 sequels. So it does happen sometimes where you don't have to write the whole novel. Just have a really good log line.
You can sell nonfiction on that kind of thing.
I like Steve Alton. Steve Alton is, by the way, I should plug Steve Alton. He wrote Meg. It's a good book.
Okay, right. No,
No.
not yet. I was waiting to, but you go ahead.
So for those who don't know, Tucker and Kane, they're a sort of dynamic duo. Tucker is a former Army Ranger who is no longer with the service, but he sort of escaped with his military war dog, Kane. Kane used to have a littermate, soulmate named Abel. Abel got killed. Tucker was upset. He took off with Kane. And they had first appeared in Bloodline. And then I spun them off, and with Grant Blackwood, we wrote a couple standalones featuring that character. They appeared again in Kingdom of Bones, and they will again occur in the book After Tides of Fire, so they're coming up. Has anybody read Kingdom of Bones? And who gave me name suggestions? Just Andrew? Of course Andrew did. Well, can't say anything. We're the ends of Kingdom of Bones if you haven't read Kingdom of Bones. So there's a little contest going on in the background that's tied to Kingdom of Bones.
Anyone else? I keep waiting for a combustion here between the two dogs, but so far nothing has happened.
They're
Yes, sir.
slowly working their way towards each other.
I'm a big fantasy reader.
Yes.
And so I was just wondering if there's any classic or contemporary fantasy authors that in particular you draw inspiration from for the series.
Again, I read George R. R. Martin before he was ever. I read him when I was in high school, back when he was doing writing more science fiction type of stuff. And I remember I was writing I had finished my first fantasy novel way back in the past. I was writing my second fantasy novel, and I got a copy of Game of Thrones, and I'm reading it. And you get to the scene where Jon Snow finds Ghost, the name, and the whole litter of direwolves. And I thought, this is just, I can't write this well. This is so frustrating. So I threw their book, first edition hardback of Game of Thrones, across the room in Australia, and I broke the spine of the book. And so again, big fan of the. Unbeknownst to me, and I had this conversation with George R. Martin at a panel once. So I finished my 5-book fantasy series, and went on with life. And then I was reading the next George R. Martin book, and I realized, oh, my main character in the Witch series comes from a little town called Winterfell. And so I was at the panel. I told George, I think I ripped off Winterfell and put Winterfell in my book. He said, well, when did your book come out? It was like 1997. My book came out after that. So that's again. But I still read a lot of fantasy. There's I like Ted Williams. I read Ted Williams. Ted Williams I like a lot. Terry Brooks, I grew up reading Terry Brooks. He was the one that actually helped get my first fantasy novel sold.
That's a great story, by the way. Have you told them that story?
Maybe have you heard the Terry Brooks story?
It's a great
Everybody
story.
else has heard the Terry Brooks story. You have so heard the Terry Brooks story.
Well, you had a lot of new people here tonight, so you can tell them that.
Well,
We'll
these
wind
people
up
aren't
with it.
new. They're close. A couple more years, I can call them stalkers. They're not quite there, but they're almost there.
They'll be good-natured about it. It's a great story.
Yes, I'm worried.
Right. That's
Exactly.
right.
But you got to
What
earn
happened
your
to my
stripes.
puppy? Is he down there causing havoc?
So the Terry Brooks story. So I mentioned before I was working on the thriller that I could not get sold. It takes a while to get those rejections. So during that time where I just thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. I began working in the first book in the Witchfire series, and during this beginning of summer, I got that agent who said, "Hey, I think I can sell Subterranean." I said, "Well, good luck, lady, because it was rejected 49 different times. But if you think it's not going to cost me anything, have at it." And so then she, over the summer, backtrack for just a second. She asked me when that phone call. She said, "Okay, Jim, I want to try to sell Subterranean, but will help me if you have a second book already in development. It helps me to sort of have proving that you're a writer. So what are you working on now?" Well, so I'm glad you asked it. I'm about halfway through this fantasy novel. I'm really excited about it. And she goes, "Ugh." And she makes that noise. I can still repeat that. Ugh. It haunts me. I don't like fantasy. I don't read fantasy. I don't know any of the fantasy editors out there or the fantasy publishers. Stop writing that. Write me another thriller. And I'm thinking, I've got 49 different rejections. This agent wants to represent me, so I better do what she says. So I tell her, okay, I'll do that. I was lying. I had absolutely no intention to stop writing that fantasy because I was convinced she was never going to sell Subterranean. So also, the other inciting factor was I had submitted the first couple chapters of Witchfire to a writers' conference, the Maui Writers' Conference. See, you heard the Maui Writers' Conference story. See, now she's remembering it. So I submitted to the Maui Writers' Conference, and it's a big conference. It was at the end of summer. This was all occurring at the beginning of summer. I thought, well, I'm going to, at least through the rest of summer, finish this fantasy novel, and I'll see how this editor does, or the agent does, in trying to sell my thriller. Over the course of summer, she began collecting her rejection letters from publishing houses. And I'm like, another rejection, Jim. My reaction was, told you so. It's unpublishable. I've got verifiable proof in writing. So end of summer comes. I go to the conference. And this is my very first writers' conference. I'm very nervous. Again, unpublished. Going there to learn, meet some people, talk shop. And the first night of the conference is a sort of a meet and greet tea. It's where all the attendees and conference members can mingle in a big ballroom in Maui at the end of summer. That's important. They required gentlemen to wear jackets. If you had like a little leather patch here, you get extra points. You could wear a Hawaiian shirt under there, but you had to wear a jacket because it's a literary event. Maui, end of summer, hot ballroom, wearing a jacket, not a good, didn't quite have all the bugs worked out of this conference yet. And so I go into this conference room, into the ballroom, and I would swear as soon as those doors open, everybody closes into little cliques and circles, and I don't know what to do. I'm not a good conversationalist. I don't know how to break into a conversation. Do you sidle up to a group and go, I like dogs, and hope for the best? So I'm getting more and more nervous and uncomfortable and sweating through my jacket by this point. And I look across the room and I say, hey, that guy over there, that's somebody I know from Sacramento. It's not, it's a friend of a friend, but that's enough of a connection. We're going to bond at the hip at this point because I need this. So I get across the ballroom, I clap this gentleman on the shoulder and say, what are you doing here? And he turns around, and this relates to the movie I just recommended. It's Ron Howard, the director. And without his hat, he doesn't have a lot of hair up here like me. And he looks a little bit like my friend from Sacramento, but he obviously is not. And he turns to me and goes, well, sir, I was invited. And I'm like, just checking. Just make sure you're not crashing this party. So then I, slink away, tail between my legs, and trying to get away from him. Now I'm even more nervous. Now I got to worry about, Ron Howard's security coming after me, besides everything else. While I'm in retreat, I look across the room and I see somebody else I recognize. I know that person. That's Terry Brooks. If nothing else at this conference, I'm going to shake Terry Brooks' hand. I was a stalker. So I get up there, and this time I circle him a few times. I check the name tag. Was it Ron Howard in disguise? And Mr. Brooks, I've been reading it since I was in junior high. I remember getting a sunburn because I didn't want to get out of the open window because I was so engrossed with the story, and just an honor to meet you. And he looks down at me and goes, "Yeah, I'm a fan of yours too." I thought, oh, this is informative. Terry Brooks is an asshole. Did not know that. Why is he insulting an unknown, person at this conference? And he goes, no, you got a weird last name, sir. Because I was using my real last name. I recognize your last name, and I was one of the judges at this year's contest. I read your fantasy piece. I liked it so much, I invited my editor to come to the conference because he wanted to meet you. So based upon that personal introduction from Terry Brooks, I was offered a 3-book fantasy deal. So I rushed to my room after that and called my agent and said, I think I sold my fantasy series. Would you help me? I don't know anything how to structure contracts or anything like that. Will you help me, make sure I don't get screwed over? She said, sure, I love fantasy. That 15% engenders a lot of love from those agents. And she goes, by the way, I currently have 2 publishing houses currently bidding for Subterranean. So that's how I ended up from flying into Maui unpublished, flying out of Maui with 2 different publishing deals. So, and 3 different names. It got very confusing.
Did you ever get a chance to talk to Ron Howard again?
I think he's got a restraining order against me at this point.
I thought he'd figure back into the story, but
I have an issue with directors apparently. As I was at Comic-Con one year. I think I told this story too, maybe not. I was at Comic-Con, and who's been Comic-Con? Just me. Okay, it's a few people. It's very crowded. Everything's jammed. Everybody's mingling together pre-COVID, and it's hard. Once you have something you want to throw away, it's hard to find a garbage can in that place. And each of the garbage cans where you can normally find them is next to where they sell the hot dogs and pretzels. So I've got some wrinkled up stuff that I don't want. I'm going to throw away. And I get to this line. There's a line in front of the pretzel place. And people waiting to get their pretzels, and then right behind the line, there's a trash can, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna get through there, this big wad of stuff, and get it into that trash can. So I'm waiting for a break in the line to develop, and finally it opens. My moment. So I shove my hand like this, and this gentleman steps forward. I punch him in the stomach. It was Quentin Tarantino. So apparently, I'm destined to assault directors of one way or the other.
movie. Right. That's a question I should ask before we quit, is what's going on in the film world, if anything, film and television.
Again, I announced before, I think, because it's been the Sigma Force has been, the entire series, not just one book, the entire series has been an option.
Right.
And they just renewed the option. I think, I don't know, they had renewed it the last time I was here, or it was relatively recent they renewed the option, and so they bought another chunk of time. So they seem very active about wanting to turn it into a series, yes, on television.
So it's going to be a TV series?
Yes.
Yeah. Probably the terminal list and stuff like that is helping.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I always thought it would be hard to trim a Sigma novel into a 2-hour movie. There's just so many moving parts. So to me, it made more sense even to have it in a serial format. So hopefully we'll see that happen one of these days.
Great.
How
Yes,
about
sir.
Jake Ransom? Anything? Sorry to interrupt.
So Jake Ransom, again, it was I began a sort of a middle school series, which they told me once a year is fine, and I gave them 2 books. And now they said we want it every 6 months. I said, well, I can't do it every 6 months. I've got other contracts. So well, if you can't do it every 6 months, let's just wait till you can do all 5 books in the series, and then we will publish them in a 6-month schedule. So I've already a long time ago wrote Cauldron of Doom, the 3rd book in the Jane Grey. It's sitting on my shelf right now. Somebody can read it if they want to, but I still have to write 4 and 5. Once it's all done, then we'll repackage it and sell it. It's a deal. By the way, who did the audio to Jake Ransom? He was a little known guy, and everybody didn't know him at the time. I didn't even know it at this point. Someone else alerted me to this fact. It was Pedro Pascal. So The Mandalorian is the one who did the audio of the 2 Jake Ransom novels.
Love it. Yes, sir.
I hope it's a little better. But no, it does not come easier. I wish it did. I try to hone my craft, try to get, whenever I teach writing, one thing I always, or not teach writing, but everyone always asks me, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to a writer, a young writer who's looking to get his, break in the business? I said, well, there's the old adage, you should be writing every day. You need to practice your craft. You should expect to write 1 million words before you should expect to be published. But you should be reading every night. And that whatever problem you have during your writing day, as your whatever, whether it's how to do dialogue or how to describe a character without having to look in a mirror, when you read at night, you see sort of how another author handles that. It begins to untie that knot. So if you're writing every day and reading every night, your prose is going to get stronger and stronger. I don't understand authors who say, I don't have time to read, or I'm afraid to read because I'm going to be influenced. I want to be influenced. I read to be influenced. I want to keep doing that today. What tricks are these new authors doing to create these different scenes, or that's a cool phrase. I never heard that used that way. Or the way they're presenting dialogue, I've never seen that before. And so I'll note it down. So then maybe in the future novel, I'll begin to incorporate some of that.
How do you feel about artificial intelligence? You give them so many words, whatnot, and they can make an essay.
So again, Chat GPT. I should put this online, by the way. There's that AI bot that can produce scientific papers and fools people. And a friend of mine in Boston challenged the Chat GPT and said, write a short story about somebody shooting down a weather balloon in the style of James Rollins. And it produced like a 3-page little vignette of this happening. I thought, that actually does sound a little bit like me. It was creepy. It was really creepy.
Wow. All right, one more, because we've kept you in these chairs now for 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I can see everybody starting to squirm. Let's wind up with you.
One question is, who's your favorite character so far in the series?
Okay. I would too. I won't resent. Hopefully he doesn't resent me, so he'll do that. I would love to see the same one. I think that's a really cool movie. It'd be fun to see. What was your first question again?
Who's your favorite character in a series? You have to love all your children.
Again, yes. Each character, I like for different reasons. It's fun having the puzzle solver of Gray and being able to play with his mindset. But of course, obviously, there's certain characters I do love a lot. I love Tucker and Kane because, again, veterinarian. If there's a guy working with a dog, cool. Kowalski first appeared in Ice Hunt, one of my standalone novels. I liked him so much. 4 books later, I'm thinking, I miss Kowalski. I'm going to recruit him to Sigma. He does not belong there, but I'm going to recruit him to Sigma. So that he comes. Subterranean, back to my first novel that was rejected by 49 different agents. Lissa, my editor, picked it up and said, "Hey Jim, this is unpublishable." I thought, "Well, why did you buy it?" He said, "Well, it's unpublishable. It's a diamond in the rough. Between us two, we're going to make this into a wonderful novel. The first thing you have to do, Jim, is, again, I told her the gist of subterranean is I'm going to take 4 or 5 characters, throw them 2 miles underneath the earth, throw in some monsters, and shake. Based on the detailed outline, I began writing the novel. So it took them till about page 150 before they got down that hole. And Alyssa said, they have to be down that hole by page 50. You need to cut out 100 pages of your first part of your novel. But that's not possible, Alyssa. If you want to publish it, it's going to be possible. So I began trimming, tightening it. And I look, they're down their hole on page 100. I said 50. All right, trim. Look, they're down the hole on page 80. I said 50. Change font size and change the margins. Try to cheat that way. Page 65. I said 50, Jim. The last scene that got cut on that book, which I've shared occasionally out there, is where you find out how Kalid got the C4 that he uses as a bomb later on in the story. And he gets delivered to his hotel by this Eurasian assassin, very deadly, very scary, and she wears a little dragon pendant that she wears. That was Seishan. So she ended up being cut out of Subterranean and ended up on the cutting room floor, but I liked Seishan, so it took, again, until Map of Bones for Seishan to reappear in the story. So certain characters just stick with me that I just can't quite let go of.
Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Sure.
As always, it's been a real
Thank you,
pleasure.
guys. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it very much.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.